the afternoon of January 6th, a violent group of white supremacist insurgents took the U.S. Capitol building, enabled by law enforcement, and occupied it for hours.
These events were planned and known well in advance.
Despite months of buildup and ample warning, law enforcement chose to accommodate and in some cases join the rioters instead of resisting their incursion.
The minimal response of law enforcement stands in stark contrast to the response to protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd, which were met by the National Guard, who donned full riot gear in advance of evaluating the situation.
We also recognize a sharp contrast between the response to disabled activists in 2017, who were dragged from that same Capitol building.
This brutality has been replicated in the response to countless demonstrations in support of Black liberation and the rights of marginalized groups.
In the comparison between these events, we see which circumstances law enforcement respond to with forceful preemptive measures and which ones they are willing to see play out.
For decades, law enforcement agencies have attempted to convince civilians that they are able to use behavioral indicators to predict dangerous criminality.
These indicators are often cited as the justification for police murders of Black civilians.
The suspected presence of weapons, the resistance to officers' instructions, the destruction of property, and being out of place.
On January 6, however, we saw that law enforcement does not use these indicators when responding to white supremacists.
Dangerous zealots planted improvised explosive devices and used weapons against officers without being fired upon.
Insurgents violently pushed and beat law enforcement officers who did not escalate to the use of deadly force.
Radical extremists were permitted to break windows, steal furniture, and vandalize press equipment uninterrupted.
Violent fanatics scaled walls and destroyed barriers to enter highly secured areas and gained access to materials vital to national security and were escorted from the building unscathed.
In these restrained responses, we see that law enforcement already has the tools to avoid escalating to the use of violent force. Patterns of racialized police violence indicate that officers choose to use restraint based on the race and ethnicity of the subject they've encountered.
The alliance between white supremacy and law enforcement is unmistakably clear. We see the effect of whiteness serving as an analog for innocence. We see the consequences of conditioning law enforcement to associate Blackness with criminality, Arab and Muslim identities with terrorism, and disabled people with deviance.
The connection between law enforcement and white supremacist groups is more than an unfortunate alignment of ideologies and biases. Direct ties between law enforcement and white supremacist organizations have been identified by the FBI and persist today.
In 2006, the FBI identified that white supremacists were purposefully infiltrating law enforcement agencies.
Despite overwhelming evidence of collusion collected and reported by the FBI and the Brennan Center, these ties continue to strengthen unchallenged. Furthermore, in 2017, the FBI went on to describe white supremacist groups as posing a persistent threat of lethal violence.
Despite the reality of the threat posed by white supremacists, the majority of law enforcement efforts remain focused on criminalizing Black, poor, and disabled people.
This alliance with white supremacy both causes law enforcement to ignore very real threats and over-police communities which simply exist outside of the conditional benefits of whiteness, affluence, and ableness. Policing in Dearborn is no exception to this rule.
In the arrests and citations, we see the Dearborn police targeting Black and poor people for criminalization. We see Black individuals grossly overrepresented and white people, especially white women, grossly underrepresented.
In records of civil cases settled by the city, we see poverty used to profile civilians of color for assault.
We see disability used to justify the police murders of 3 Black individuals, Ernest Screglin, Kevin Matthews, and Janet Wilson.
We see our communities surveilled and religious leaders such as Imam Uthman Abdullah targeted.
All because we are led to believe that the threat comes from outside of white communities and outside of whiteness.
We cannot continue to conflate policing with public safety and law enforcement with community building.
We continue to demand the city of Dearborn divest from policing, an institution created by white supremacy, enforcing and complicit in anti-Black racism.
We continue to demand a vision for public safety that is founded in community rather than oppression.